Reading comes from Genesis 15, verses 7 through 21. Please feel free to read along with me. And he said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to possess it. But he said, Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abram, know that certain of your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out of many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the wrongdoing of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now this was about when the sun had set, then it was very dark, and behold, a smoking oven and a flame torch appeared, which passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, and from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, and Amorites, the Canaanites, and Girgashites, and the Jebusites. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Kevin. No, you can leave right there. We'll move the whole thing. You may be seated. Good morning. Quick little administrative note. It's my fault. PNF is not on the 12th because it's on Friday. It's on the 11th. It's not on Saturday. If you come on Saturday, you'll be greeted with youth students who have their oikos, so we will not be here. So Friday, 7:30, that's my fault. And then also for the O Family offering, instructions on how to do so will be in this week's weekly email. So if you're not subscribed to that, another reason why you should. And then look out for that, because there will be specific instructions on how to give here and also online, so that it does not go to the wrong places. When you're at a big church, we need to be sure of where our offering goes. That may sound weird, so that it goes to the right people. Okay, so you can give online and or here in person, and like I said, instructions will be on the weekly, and so please do be mindful. We'll also go over it next week, but just as a programming note. Okay, let's begin. Since we've been in Abram's life for almost 2 months now, quite a while, I think we can say with confidence that Abram's life is one that's defined and characterized by many things, but in particular, promises, right? The reason why Abram leaves the homeland is because God promises land, nation, son, and a great name if he follows him. And the reason why Abram continues to follow, right, is because God continually reminds him and reaffirms the promises that he's made. At every significant moment of Abram's life so far, you may have noticed that God is reaffirming, re-specifying, right, giving greater detail to these promises that he's been making throughout. And then, as such, because Abram's life is one characterized by promises, Abram's life is also then quite complicated, in my opinion, because there is a great and inherent beauty and darkness with promises as a whole. Promises kept are usually quite beautiful and amazing. I hope you've experienced that in your lifetime. Promises that are broken, well, they're full of pain and hurt and suffering, and you've probably experienced that as well. And we know why this is. Because promises by nature are completely dependent upon whether they're kept or not. And unfortunately, because we live in our world and we are human beings and so on and so forth, often life reminds us that they are not kept. And so we can say with promises then that they are quite a risky thing. If they go well, then you have great highs, amazing. But if they completely fall on its face, then you have deep, deep lows, which are not so amazing. As we've been saying throughout, promises have tension. They're inherently full of it. So if your life is then full of promises or full of promise, defined and characterized, therefore, like Abram's, then I think there is a lingering question, whether you can name it or not, that you always know, that you have in your heart, and the question is simply, how will I know? How will I be certain? Am I sure that so-and-so is going to keep that promise? Do I trust, more importantly, therefore, that so-and-so is going to keep that promise? And with certain promises, This question, how will I know, is something that never goes away and it lingers forever, in perpetuity, as they say. Why? Because it's meant to, because certain promises are ones that need to be kept over and over and over again. For instance, a key one, marriage. The bride and the groom at every wedding will share vows to one another, promises. I just officiated a wedding not too long ago. I've been very privileged and honored to officiate a good number of weddings. And the bride and the groom at every single one that I've done make these vows. I'll just use Christina's name because she's my wife. Christina, I promise to love you and treasure you in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, into the beautiful and worthy woman God has created you to be, as long as there's breath in my lungs. For those people who have officiated your wedding, that should ring bells in your head, right? You've said those words. As long as there's breath in my lungs, we'll say. You guys clicked over. Oh, we went too far. Or there was lag. I always give things away anyways, right? So we say those words, as long as there's breath in my lungs. Stop thinking about Jim Carrey, focus here, okay? We'll get to it, okay? Now, this is a vow that must be kept day after day, literally until there's breath in my lungs, practically forever. And the reason why I phrase this last part, until there's breath in my lungs, right, and not until death do us apart, because for me, 3 reasons. 1, it mimics that God breathed life into Adam's nostrils in the beginning, so I like that. 2nd, I think it's more poetic, and therefore it just hits a little different. But 3rd, I phrase it this way because it's visually impactful. Like you can visualize when someone's last breath leaves their body. And so there is this finality, this understanding that until I no longer have breath, I must keep this promise and vow over and over and over and over again. Right? Until I last breathe breath here on earth. So there are promises that do not end with it being kept. There are promises that do. One-time promises, but many others like this one, over and over again, basically forever, you must keep. So then, understandably, with these promises that must be kept over and over and over again, or if you unfortunately happen to know someone that makes promises and breaks them all the time, the question will continually linger. How will I know? There's this movie, I showed it to you earlier, Liar, Liar by Jim Carrey. He does not look like that anymore. That's my generation movie. If you know, then you're old like me. Cool. Jim Carrey in this movie is a father who's trying to become a big-time successful lawyer, okay? And to do so, he has made a great habit of twisting the truth, lying all the time, so that he can win cases and become a big-shot lawyer. Now, unfortunately, one of the side effects of this habit of his is that he over and over and over again ends up lying to his cute son named Max. I couldn't help myself, constantly breaking the promises that he makes. He says, Max, I'll be at this thing of yours. I'll be at your baseball game, so on and so forth. I'll show up to this. Yeah, I'll do this for you. But every single time, because of work, he breaks the promise. And so his son, Max, makes a wish that his dad, for 24 hours, cannot lie. Literally can't do it. And of course, this has major implications, and because it's a Jim Carrey movie, has hilarious implications, therefore. But the reason why the son makes this wish is because deep down, he wants to know this. Does my dad mean what he says? When he makes these promises, is he deep down intending with every fiber of his being to keep it? Is he telling the truth? Or is he twisting the truth, telling me what I want to hear so that he can get what he wants? The son is basically asking, how will I know? Well, Abram is in this exact same place as Max in the movie Liar, Liar. Last week we saw Abram is afraid. And God assures him. He's afraid of revenge from the kings that he just defeated. He's afraid of regret, perhaps, wondering if he made a mistake by not taking the rewards of the king of Sodom. He's also afraid, most importantly, that he will maybe never actually get a son. And so what does God do? God reassures him. You're going to get your own son, physical, biological son. Also, you're going to have many, many descendants, right? As numerous as the stars that you can't count in the night sky. And then verse 6, we saw Abram believes God, credits God this as righteousness, trustworthiness. But we also said that this verse isn't only talking about verses 1 through 5, but all of chapter 15, so our text for today. And in truth, this is a major theme of Abram's life through and through. Well, then as we pick up the story in verse 7 today, we see a fourth fear. Will I ever actually get the land that you promised me, God? And this is a real fear. Because just like he does not yet have a son, Abram does not yet own any land. In actuality, Abram never owns any land in his lifetime. The only land that he ever ends up owning in his entire life is a little plot that he and his wife are buried in. The promised land, as Kevin read for us, is for his descendants many, many generations later. And so through it all, here in chapter 15, the critical question on Abram's heart and mind is simply, how will I know? Okay? How will I know? And perhaps you've had this question in life too. So then let's pick up the story in verse 7. In verse 7, then God begins to address it. Before he asks the questions, God says to Abram, I am Yahweh who brought you out of the Ur of Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. God reminds Abram, this is how it started. This is the promise that I made you. This is everything that's going to happen. Although you won't know until much, much later, you will get this land, and I promise that I'll give it to you because I promised to you before you left your original homeland. So verse 8, Abram gets to the question, how may I know that I'm going to get it, God? Now, if you're wondering if this is Abram being defiant or rebellious, angry, yada, 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 talking back to God, oh yeah, how do I know? That's not what this is. The reason why we know, as we said last week, he addresses God, O Lord God, or O Sovereign Lord, or O God Yahweh. It's a very reverent and honorable way to address God, and so he's not doing this, right? He is not questioning in defiance God's character or anything like that. This question, how will I know, is very similar to the story of the father and his son. Do you know the story in the Gospels, right? There's a father who has a son, he has convulsions and all that sort of stuff. So then he asks Jesus, hey, can you heal my son? And the way he asks this question to Jesus, he goes, if you can do anything, take pity and help me, right? And then Jesus' response is, if I can, all things are possible to him who believes. And the father says these classic words, I do believe, but help my unbelief. Abram's question is like this. I do believe. Just like this father. I do believe. It's just hard sometimes, right? I need some help, God. I need some reassurance. I do believe, but help my unbelief. By the way, there is a difference in this. In Luke chapter 1, story of Zacharias and Elizabeth and their son, if you know this, right? Zacharias is told, right, by an angel that you're going to have a son. Now, the situation that he's in with his wife is very similar to Abram and Sarai. They're old. Elizabeth is barren. So he's like, how in the world is it going to happen? How will I know, right, that this is going to happen? How will I know for certain, right? And then Zacharias is punished. He's made mute until his son is going to be born. Why? The angel tells us because he did not believe. There's two ways to do this. In the movie Liar, Liar, the boy, Max, believes with all of his heart that his dad is true, that his dad loves him. He wants to keep all these promises. He believes with every fiber of being. So that's why he makes this wish. His mom, Jim Carrey's wife in the movie, does not believe with all certainty, right? She does not believe that indeed he means it. She thinks that her son is being played by his dad, and so she feels terrible for him, so she's trying to protect him, right? So you can ask this question in two ways. In this instance, Abram believes, but he needs a little bit of help. So with this question then, now in the open between God and Abram, God begins to respond. And if you thought last week's response with the whole stars in the night sky thing was crazy, this week's response is a bananas. B-A-N-A-N-N-S, if you know what I mean. That kind of bananas. I didn't know any other way to explain it to you, but just that. It's crazy. So here goes. Verse 9. So then God says to him, Abram, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. God begins directing Abram with very specific things. Then verse 10 and 11. Then Abram brought all these things to God and cut them in two, laid each half opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds. And the birds of prey then come down to the carcasses, and Abram drives them away. Abram, as soon as God tells him what to do, gets to work right away. But notice, rather than just bringing the things that God told him to bring, he brings them and starts cutting them in half and arranging them, everything except the birds. Now, this is a fascinating scene, but we have to visualize it for you to get it. Because sometimes we read the Bible and we don't understand what's going on. Okay, so I got to get up and you got to visualize this with me. This is a picture for reference. Okay, visualize this with me. God says to Abram, go get all these things. So then Abram goes and gathers all these animals, right? The different kinds, different sizes, all that sort of stuff. Imagine, they're still alive. Then once he's in this place where God has told him to bring it, he then begins to cut these animals in half, which means he has to kill them. There's a lot of noise. Animals do not go quietly when you kill them. There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of smells, a lot of these things. So he's doing all this work one by one, cutting these animals out. If you've ever tried to cut meat, imagine cutting a live animal in half, okay? And I don't know what kind of tools they're using. Don't know, don't really matter. It's crazy business. So after he then cuts all these things, I'm imagining that he might maybe cut one, and then I have no idea how this goes, but I would cut one, and then I would arrange it here, Put this one here. Again, I'm covered in blood. Cut another one. Put one here. And then put one here. Cut another one. Put one here. Are you getting the picture? And then he leaves the birds alone, thankfully. Right? For whatever reason. Right? So this is what's happening here. It's insane. Right? So he places half of the birds on one side and then the other half on the other side. And of course, the birds, right, the vultures in the picture, they're coming down. Why? Because all they want to do is eat the dead animals. So Abram is shooing them away. It is a madhouse scene. Fascinating by all accounts. Well, what's going on here in this scene? Although God didn't specify what's going on, Abram and God knows exactly what's going on, and something that everyone in those days would have known as well right away. Why? Because they are setting up a covenant ceremony. And how do they know? Because this is God's direct, immediate response to Abram's question of how will I know? How will I know, God, that you're going to keep your promises? I believe you, but how can I know for sure? And God's response, without rebuke, again, that's critical, go get these animals. And without the specific instructions, Abram goes, God wants to set up a covenant. Now, the way they did covenants back then are so very different from the way they do covenants today, right? First of all, we don't call them covenants, we call them contracts. You may have signed one or two in your lifetime, but they're both essentially the same. They're promises with two parties. Here's how it works today, right? There are two parties, right? They draft up a contract with all the terms in front of them, right? You have the document, Then one party signs it and then hands it to the other, and then they sign it. And once both have signed it, it is now binding. An example of this that you may know is athletes. Whenever athletes sign their contract, 3 years for X number of $1 million, yada, 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 right? The team and the agent of the player have to draft up all the terms of the contract, how much it's going to get paid, all these little nuanced things that you and I don't care about. And then there's always that scene in the picture where the player comes and all he's got to do is put on his signature, right? And then, or her signature, and then boom, done. 3 years, or Pat Mahomes, 10 years for $150 million, so on and so forth, yada, yada, yada. Or another example is marriages. Every marriage I've officiated, it works a little different here in Texas than in some other places, but the couple has to go to the courthouse. They got to fill out their license application, right? And then when you find it, you got to sign it saying, I agree to all the terms of what this marriage license says, right? Then after they do all that, then the courthouse sends them an actual marriage license, depending on where it is, long, whatever. They bring that to the wedding. And after I do the wedding ceremony, then we go into a special room with the photographers. We take pictures. Me, I look so important because, you know, my signature is important apparently. So I sign the thing saying I done marriage, everything done. Then they got to take that thing to the courthouse. The courthouse stamps it, seals, boom, their signature. We affirm it, and then they give it back to the couple, and then now everything is official. That's how this works. That's a contract. And within these contracts, inevitably, there's always terms, things that say if one side does not, keep their end of the bargain, then there are consequences. There are prices to pay. That's how contracts work. Well, in those days, similar, but quite different. Remind, these are ancient societies, aka there was no written stuff. They're not stated law societies, as they might call them. This is actually even before the Ten Commandments, where they wrote the laws on a stone tablet. So this is way, way, way back. They are an oral storytelling society, aka word of mouth. Everything is done via word of mouth. So to make a covenant, a contract, or a promise meant you had to physically act out the consequences of the covenant to make sure everyone knew what was going on. You act them out so that everyone can see, everyone can know, and therefore everyone can experience what will happen if either party breaks the covenant. This is a dress rehearsal gone mad, like so much more serious than anything like that. This is what we're told in Jeremiah 34:18-20. Sorry about the small words. I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not fulfilled the words of my covenant, which they have made before me, when they cut the calf in two and pass between its parts, the officials of Judah, officials of Jerusalem, court officers, priests, and all the people of the land who pass between the parts of the calf, I will give them into the hand of their enemies, into the hands of those who seek their life, and their dead bodies will be food for the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. You don't keep this covenant, bad news bears. More specifically, whatever we've done to these animals will happen to either party if they do not keep their end of the covenant. Now, I've said this, but did it click? This is God's response to Abram's question, how will I know if you will keep your promises? My hope and my prayer is that your mind will be blown as we start to understand what this means. God responds to Abram's question, saying, how will you know? Here's how we'll know. Let's make a covenant right here, right now. And if this doesn't seem like a big deal, again, bear with me. Now, I prepared this for students because I thought we were going to have a youth worship, but I forgot that today was not, because anyways, whatever. Here it is. Parents in the room, future parents-to-be, or if you're young enough and you're still kind of like a kid, but kind of in that middle place, right? All of you, imagine with me. Imagine that whenever parents make promises, if you do this, I'll do this, or I won't do this, so on and so forth, I'll stop doing this, yada, yada, yada. For my dad, it was always, I'll stop smoking, I'll stop drinking, whatever. Let's say they make these promises to you. Imagine if we lived in a world where the child was able to ask their parents, yeah, how will I know? Before they get right upside the face, right? Imagine. I'm imagining the house you grew up in, or the houses you leave. Okay, we'll not go there, right? That this might happen. But imagine that children are able to ask their parents, how will I know you're going to keep this promise? And imagine that the parents aren't going to say, what, you don't trust me? What, you think I'm a liar? None of that stuff. Imagine. And imagine that to the question, how will I know that you will keep your promise? That then the parent will say, how will you know? If I don't keep my end, this and this will happen. And the consequences are big. How will you know? Now, Christine and I have this discussion at home all the time. We always say to one another, hey, you know, it's interesting. The kids, they always have consequences for their actions. They don't do this, right? Everyone knows. If you don't do this, you get this, quote unquote. But I go, what are ours as parents? Did you notice? We act like tyrants. We can do whatever we want, and there's no consequences to anything that we do. At least not to our kids. So we in our home try to make sure that there's consequences for our actions. Let me give you a silly example. I love to conserve energy, not for the money's sake, because I am all about creation care. We should care for God's earth, be fruitful, right? So I tell everyone, turn off the lights in the house. Right? Stop wasting it. By the way, we have solar too, so it's not a money thing. It's an energy thing. Anyways, turn off all the lights. And when they don't, the consequence is either the person who discovers that the person didn't turn off the light gets to name a number of push-ups. Or, if you don't like that, then you get a kurban, which is a forehead flick. And I got long fingers, it hurts. Okay? But it goes for everybody in the house. So whenever it happens, Mason is the worst. He always forgets. He's always doing push-ups and whatnot. But you know what? Okay. But the moment either I or Christina forget, the joy on the kids' faces, ooh, it's something else. They're like, oh, you forgot to turn off the lights. And I'm like, okay. And of course, they never choose the push-ups. That's easy. They always want the forehead flick. So then you got to put it there and do the consequence thing, right? Now, let me ask you, parents, would you dare? Would you dare make this type of covenant? Or let me ask you another thing. Perhaps with silly things like lights and whatever, things that you forget, keys or whatever there may be. But with big things? I wonder what would have happened in my life if my dad made a covenant with me to say, I'm going to uphold the covenant that I made with your mom. My dad's been divorced twice, remarried twice. What would my life look like if my dad made that covenant and said, if I break my end of this covenant, there will be serious consequences to pay? What would happen if you made covenants with your children and say, I will discipline you as a father or a mother should, but I will not get angry and discipline you in my anger, and if I do, there will be major consequences to pay? You wouldn't dare, would you? Well, parents not doing so is one thing. The God of the universe making a covenant with Abram is a whole nother thing. This was his idea. It is so utterly backwards. Because if there's one person in the world who need not make covenants in this way, it's God. Because why? He's holy. He's perfect. He's righteous. Everything. Parents are not righteous, not holy, not perfect by any means. We should make covenants like this to hold up our end of the bargain. But God does not need to. And yet, God's answers to Abram's, how will I know, is, yeah, let's make a covenant. It's bananas. But it gets better. Verse 12 through 16, the story suddenly shifts. And even something more strange happens. We're told the sun goes down, nearly a whole day has passed since the whole night sky thing. And when the sun is about to set, Abram, we're told, falls into a deep sleep. By the way, the word for deep sleep is the same word that Adam fell into, right? In the beginning when God does the surgery, right? The bones, that thing. Same. So Abram is knocked out. Anesthesia. I'm looking at Dan. That's what he does for his living, right? Surgery, you're done. You're not, the whole world is gone. But in this place, we're told, a terror and a darkness falls upon Abram. Now this is a strange thing in the Hebrew as well. Most of the scholars suggest that this is indicating a deep spiritual darkness. The best way I've heard it phrased is by Tim Keller, who heard it from somebody else, and he basically says, imagine being in a home that's on fire, right? Smoke is everywhere, fire ablaze. He says, if you've ever been in this situation and you're waiting for rescue, the only place you can get fresh air, apparently, again, I'm just going to trust people, is the 1 inch of ground that you have at the bottom. Apparently, there's fresh air there. And so if you want to breathe in a situation, if you're smart, apparently you cover your head with like a towel, and then you'll just get the little breaths on the bottom. Because that's only the place that you have. Now, this is a place of suffocation, darkness, and all these things. And what we're told, right, most people think that this is the kind of situation that Abram is in spiritually. A spiritual suffocation and darkness. And in this place, God then tells him appropriate things that match. He says, you and your descendants, lots of suffering going on. 400 years of slavery and oppression. But after all of that, we're told that they're going to come out and they're going to finally get the land. I'm going to judge the oppressors. That's God fulfilling 12:3 when he says, I will curse those who curse you. But Abram, don't worry. You won't get this land. You'll have long died by then, but you're going to die in peace. That's significant. But this is what's going to happen to your descendants. Again, crazy stuff. Abram, in this deep spiritual darkness, finds out what's going to happen to all the descendants that he's been promised. And the news is certainly not good in any way. 400 years of suffering and oppression? No, not good. But we wonder, what's going on here? Why this part of the passage? Well, before the covenant is signed and therefore finalized, Abram is being shown the reality of the covenant, or the terms of the covenant, for his side of the covenant. Right? God has proven throughout this entire narrative that he's trustworthy in verses 1-5, right? And everything that happened before. Remember, he suggests the covenant, even though he does not have to. And Abram, we're told, continually believes in verse 6, right? And gives credit to God for his righteousness and so on and so forth. But have you wondered, what about Abram's side of the promise? Right? Like, has Abram even thought about his side of the promise? Does anyone think about their side of the promise? Right? When you get married, do you think about your side of the promise, or you only think about the other side of the promise? I think we only think about the other side of the promise because, in truth, we're mostly irrational, selfish, prideful, and therefore very foolish people. And so whenever we enter into the covenant, most of the time, we are not thinking whether we're going to come through or not. Of course we're going to come through. It's me. Like at a wedding. If you're wondering if your spouse is going to always love you to the end of the days until breath in the lungs, have you ever wondered, will I love this person until I have no more breath in my lungs? We don't. We just don't. No one enters a promise with the intention of breaking. At least I hope they don't. But as life would have it, as you know, we break it all the time, don't we? So I think here what's happening is Abram is coming to the reality. God is showing him, what happens if I don't keep it? Abram is being forced to answer, how will I know if I keep it? Because, as you may know and need to be reminded, covenants are two-sided. At the wedding, both bride and groom state their vows. So Abram is being confronted with his and his descendants' part of the covenant, and the reality stings because it's fraught with failure and unfortunate unfaithfulness. And it's already happened. Remember Egypt? So Abram is being shown that's why there's going to be suffering, because there's consequences. He's being reminded, as we do, sin has its consequences, and they're neither good nor pleasant. The journey in life of following God is not always going to be easy nor pleasant. Why? Because of my sin and humanity's sin. So we need to be reminded of that. But thankfully, the story continues. Verse 17. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. The sun is now set. The stage, therefore, is set. It's like a movie. You know how it gets dark? Very dark. Pitch black dark. And then all of a sudden, behold, a smoking oven and a flaming torch appears. Now, this phrase also is very difficult to translate in the Hebrew. But here's what we do know. The words for smoke and flame, or blaze, are the same words that are used for God's presence at Mount Sinai when God's presence come down, and the pillar of fire that guides Israel throughout the wilderness. So what we know is this. In the pitch black, the presence of God appears. And then get this. It walks through the pieces that had been set before him. This is God saying, I sign the covenant. Officially, he's saying, if I do not keep my end of the covenant, then what happened to these animals happens to me. And again, this is stupefying in every single way, because what it means is that what was impossible to even think about is now somehow possible. The infinite and immutable God, the one who is forever and therefore cannot die, he can die? And God says, yeah, because on that day, Yahweh made the covenant, signed, sealed, and delivered, official, as they might say. But let's pause. Are you seeing what's happening here? Are you understanding what this means and what this is telling us? This church, without a shadow of a doubt, is the gospel. As clear as can be, perhaps in one of the more dramatic and amazing ways you can say it. You see, Abram, who's fearful, weary, full of doubt, asked God, how will I know that you're going to keep all your promises? And God says, how will I know? Here's how you know. Let's make a covenant. But did you notice? And this is astronomical. Only God walks through the pieces. Abram never signs the covenant. This is absurdity for two major reasons. Here they are. If you're maybe like me or others and you thought, man, those consequences in verses 12 through 16, man, they're harsh. Man, I don't know if it's worth it. That's what costs to follow God. Like, I don't know all about that. For real, like, I don't know. Like, and if that's you, I totally get it, by the way. But did you notice? Did you notice what's not included in those consequences? Did you notice what's noticeably, conspicuously absent from those consequences? Death and separation. Did you notice that? Abram and his descendants are never going to be cut in two, never going to be separated from God, never going to be cut off from anything. Death and the cut off thing is the end of the promise. So if that happens, then land, nation, forget about it. None of that's going to happen. Why? Because they would be dead, split in two, eaten by the vultures. What this means is, though there are consequences for us not keeping our end of the promise, though there are certainly consequences for our sin, the ultimate and most critical consequence will never, ever be included. And do you know why it's not included? Because they're only reserved for God and God alone. Even if Abram and his descendants, and therefore us, break the covenant, when they don't trust God and they don't follow God, remember, the call is to leave, follow God, trust God, all those things. Even if they don't do that, if we don't live according to God's ways, if we don't do any of those things, when they break it over and over, which they do, of course, which they do, over and over and over again. Read the Old Testament. It's just them breaking covenant over and over and over and over again. But no matter what they do, the ultimate consequence, which is to be cut off from God, will never, ever happen to God's people, and never, ever, 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 forever and ever to us. Do you know why that's possible? And this is the reason number two. Because by walking through the covenant alone, what God is saying is this. And if you don't remember anything else, remember this. By walking through the covenant alone, God is saying, if I happen to break the covenant, then let what happened to these animals happen to me. But also, and more importantly, if you, Abram, if you, Israel, if you, church, ever break this covenant, then let this, what has happened to the animals, happen to, no, not you, but to me, because of you. If this promise and covenant and contract is ever broken for any reason, no matter who breaks it, I, God, will take the ultimate consequence. People who are married in the room, who want to be married, hope to be married in the room, would you ever dare make a vow where you said, no matter what, because I vowed to you that I will love you, treasure you, honor you until there's no more breath in my lungs, even if you break it, I will keep my end and I will take everything that it costs to redeem it. You wouldn't. If you did, people would call you crazy and insane. If you've been in church, you know where we're going. This is exactly what happens. Many centuries later, Jesus of Nazareth comes down to earth. And in Matthew 27:45, we're told that a crazy darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, in the middle of the day, falls supernaturally over the earth. And on the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And God's response is, I have forsaken you because I made a covenant It's the price of the covenant. In verse 30 it says, on that day Yahweh made a covenant. That word in Hebrew is cut. On that day, by walking through the animals on his own, God cuts a covenant with Abram by himself. Why? Because it's how covenants were done. Because the consequence of breaking the covenant, being cut off, is only something that he can bear and not us. Jesus on the cross was cut off. Isaiah 53:8. He was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. Isaiah 53 is just a description of Jesus, particularly on the cross. When God turns his face away, he ignores the cries of his son. He cuts off his son. Why? Because the punishment for all the times Abram, Israel, the church, you and me would turn away and break the covenant, God says, this is how I keep my end. Forever and forever. Have you ever thought, God, how will I know? How do I know if I can trust you? How do I know if I can trust myself? Have you ever thought these two things? Here are the two things that I think you should do over and over and over again. The first one, ask the stupid question. You might have grown up in churches where they told you not to ask, not to doubt, just believe. Garbage. If Abram, the father of faith, Father Abraham, that dude, if he can ask questions, you and I, we can surely ask questions. Ask, how will I know? Won't you cry out? You see, throughout Scripture, whether it's Abram or Jesus and everybody in between, Scripture is full of the people who express their doubts and their hurts to God. Why? Because, as we said last week, doing so, crying out to God, asking him the question, fundamentally shows that we trust that God can answer and take care of it. The key to knowing that God is trustworthy is first admitting that we have difficulty believing it. And crying out is saying, God, I want to believe. I really do, and I think I do believe. I want to know, and I wish to know. I just need a little bit of help here. I do believe. Help my unbelief. Did you know that actually by not asking is us saying that we don't think God can do it? That we don't believe? By not asking, what we're saying is, I already know the answer. I know exactly what the answer is going to be. Why bother and ask? Parents in the room, once your children stop asking you, you know what it means? It means they don't trust you and they don't think you're going to do it. Questions of you doing this and being faithful to your promise as a parent is not annoyance. It's faith. Ask the question. And then wait and watch how God responds. And then as you ask the question, the second thing is simple. Look at God and keep on looking. Don't ever let your gaze go elsewhere. Look at God who walks through the pieces. If you see God walking through the pieces, it'll transform your life, I promise. And when you look at God walk through the pieces, you know what you're looking at? Jesus on the cross. If you truly see him, church, in his greatest and most glorified form on the cross, then you will say with your heart, I do not fear. Why? Because God is my shield and he is my great reward. And the more you truly see him over and over and over again, the more you will be able to say in faith, I do not and therefore will not fear. Why? Because God, you are my shield and my great reward. Genesis 15 is dumbstruck. Like, I'm awestruck by everything that happens in Genesis 15. You know why? Because everything that happens in this chapter is initiated by God. Abram is having sleepless nights. He doesn't even ask. God just appears. And then God reassures before Abram asks, I am your shield and I'm your great reward. Then Abram goes, how am I going to know that I'm going to have a son? Then God does the whole stars in the night thing. And then after that whole thing, after we're told that Abram believes, verse 7, God then says, hey, by the way, that land I promised you, don't worry, I'm going to come through. Abram doesn't ask first. And then Abram asks, how will I know? And then God initiates covenant. Everything is initiated by God through and through. The whole thing is all God. Everything in our faith is all God, not us. And God doesn't need to do any of this stuff, ever. Why? He's God, but he does. He's not the one who fails. No. He's not the one who's not kept his bargain. No. But he does. Find anyone else in the world like this. You won't. Try it. You won't. So when you look at this God, then you know what you're going to find? You're going to find that our God is first a covenant maker. He's the one who thinks covenants are a good idea, even though he knows it's going to cost his son his life. And then when you look at the covenant maker, then you're going to realize that he's the covenant keeper, the one who holds his end of the covenant through and through. Abram does get a son. He does get descendants. He does get nations. He's Father Abraham, had many sons. I love that song now. Why? Because it reminds me of God's covenant. God is faithful to Israel through and through and through, more than we'll ever know. God is the covenant keeper. You can count on him forever and ever and ever. And then when you see that God is the covenant keeper, then you'll realize that God is the covenant redeemer. And this is huge. Even when we break the promise, God redeems the promise, keeping it alive, true, and therefore forever, by taking on the punishment for our wrongdoing. We in life actually are practically masters of promises. I don't know if you know this. And so as masters of promise, because you've lived it many times, you know this too. You know that redeeming, making up for broken promises are near impossible, isn't it? And the more a promise gets broken, the harder and harder it is to redeem the promise, to get the other person to trust you ever again. I don't know who said this, but there's a quote. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. In the movie Liar, Liar, it ends with Jim Carrey doing hilarious things, seemingly having lost his family, Max and his mom and a new dude, Spencer, Fletcher? Of course, the name's stupid. Anyways, no, Fletcher is his name. Anyways, whatever. They get on a plane, they're going to California. And he finally realizes, holy moly, I'm going to lose my family. So in only Jim Carrey style, he rushes to the airport. He gets through security by literally hiding himself in a bag, gets through, and then in order to get, once he realizes that his son is on a plane and they're on the runway, do you know what he does? He hijacks one of those cargo things. Bing! And he's driving along the side of the plane. It's hilarious. You see his face pop up and he's trying to see. Of course, he's on the right side of the plane. It's a movie. And then he goes and he goes and he goes. And then finally, he sees his son. And he's screaming at him, Max, I love you. I'm so sorry. I'm never going to break promises again. I'm not lying to you. I couldn't lie because of blah, blah, blah. You can't hear anything. And so he realizes he's got his one last shot. So what he does, he puts the thing in auto drive. Somehow it's faster than the plane going off the airway. It's a movie. And then he goes in front of the airplane. He throws a shoe at the airplane window. Somehow he hits it because, you know, that's going to happen. And then they're like, oh my goodness, there's a stupid guy on the thing. And then they stop the plane. He falls off, like breaks bones or whatever, all so that he can have his son. Now, it's quite silly. But the point is pretty clear, isn't it? That's what it takes to redeem a broken promise. And our God, for all the world to see, takes his son and keeps his end, which ends up being our end of the broken promise. And he crucifies him, cuts him off from the land of the living so that we will never have to. And then he makes his son rise so that our death will never be death, but life forever. This is the God you worship. A God unlike any other. Search for all of eternity, you will not find him, nor anything like him. This is our God, the covenant maker, the keeper, and the redeemer. That throughout your life, all of your how will I knows will continually and forever become, if you fix your gaze, if you ask the questions to him, you will always be able to say with all certainty, even in your doubts, I know for certain that no matter what happens in my life, because God is the covenant maker, keeper, and redeemer, I do not and will not fear, because he is my shield and he is my great reward. I pray and I hope that that will be your life's cry. I told you I've done a lot of marriages. I'm privileged to do so. Whenever I teach them premarital, the one thing that they're supposed to remember, there's one over there, there's one over there, there's one back there, there's one future one, there's one that's going through right now, a whole bunch of people that have done it. There's a tagline you're supposed to remember. Do you know the tagline? Don't repeat it. Don't embarrass yourself. The tagline for the marriage is what? Do for my spouse that which God has done for me in Jesus Christ, and everything will follow. That is a bananas statement to make if you're willing to make it, but that is the covenant of our God to me and to you, you lucky bums. Will you approach the God of our covenant? Will you approach him with your doubts and your fears? And will you see him answer with the covenant of the cross, securing your life so that it will never end, and though it may die, it'll live now and forever to all eternity. Praise be to his name. Go to him, cry to him, and then see and therefore receive him. And then we will sing with everything we have. Take some time and then we'll sing together.